Cole, as we ease our way into summer, we're doing a book report of sorts. Yes, it's time for another edition of Page2Screen, where we read a novel, and then we watch the film adaptation of it, and then we talk about it. This is one of my favorite series that we do here on Kicking the Seat, and I'm happy to do it with you, who are a voracious reader and a lover of film. So yeah, we're going to talk about also one of my favorite films, I think, of all time, which is weird, and we'll get into why that is. It's not necessarily one of my favorite books of all time, but they kind of go together like chocolate and peanut butter. What are we talking about today, Cole? We're talking about Out of Sight, which was written by Elmore Leonard, the novel, and Out of Sight, the movie from 1998, which is turning 25 this year, starring
Wow.
George Clooney and Jennifer Lopez, and directed by Steven Soderbergh, who would go on to work with Mr. Clooney on the Ocean's movies and many other grand projects. This is sort of not the beginning of his career, certainly, but the beginning of his, there's this almost
Heisty
like
crime career.
yeah, and also the kind of the George Clooney is cool, like that, renaissance of the Rat Pack kind of thing from the late
Yep.
90s, early 2000s. So yeah, I'm excited. How are you doing?
I am just living the dream. I'm very excited to talk about this book and movie, which I found very interesting. And I think there's a very specific claim I'm going to make that I think you will probably agree with. But I've been burnt before by expecting you to agree with something I've said. So we will see. But
Get in
I'm
line.
very excited to talk about this. Watching the movie yesterday kind of got me in the mood, and I think there's a lot of interesting tidbits here.
But before we get to that, right before we jumped on here, you teased me that you have an anecdote about this movie or something that made you think of this.
Well, yeah, so I actually discovered that I might be Jack Foley, and that's not in spirit or demeanor or looks, certainly.
Do you want to
But
confess this on a podcast?
trust me, it's necessary. So a few years ago, my wife and I went to Ravinia for a concert, and we were walking back from the train on the way home, and we decided to stop in at Taco Bell. Now, I did not rob the Taco Bell, I promise. I realize how insane this sounds when I'm saying it. Um, but they have those little ordering kiosks, and there was kind of a long line even for a late night at Taco Bell. So I went ahead and put in our order, and then I typed in my name, and I accidentally switched the C in Cole for an F. So I placed our order. I was like, screw it, like I don't need to go re-enter my name or whatever. About 5 minutes later, I see a guy plop some food on the counter, and he just yells out to the entire Taco Bell, Foley! So I walked up, with all the swagger I could muster, and Foley snatched his food. The nickname did not stick. I didn't rob any banks, but it was one of the funniest moments. Aaron and I just looked at each other like, I am Foley. So watching this movie and reading this book just reminded me of that story every time I saw the name written down. Um, and I wish people would abide by the nickname by which I went in that Taco Bell, but sadly I just remain a lowly Cole these days.
You are not a lowly Cole. But here's the thing. I thought this was going to be like the kiosk didn't work. So you went up to the girl at the counter and said, look, I want you to put as many tacos as you can. I want you the hot sauce packets, not the super hot sauce packets, and none from the bottom of the drawer. Just put them in that bag. And yeah.
My friend has a burrito cannon in his suitcase.
Hey, this is a family show. No, no, it's
Burrito
totally not.
cannon.
Yes. But okay, so what is Out of Sight and why are we talking about it? Well, as I mentioned, it's 25 years old this year, which makes me feel incredibly old. But also it is, and it's something that I kind of picked up on watching it. It was solidified on this viewing that reading the novel, it occurs to me that when this movie came out, and I probably haven't watched it in about 20 years, but when it came out, I must have seen it a dozen times, either in the theater or on home video later, because reading the novel, I kept seeing the scenes from the movie play back in my head. I'm like, it's so vivid that I might as well have watched the film a week ago. They didn't miss a beat. Although it's strange because a lot of the characters are kind of switched around in terms of, you might call it today race swapping. Karen Sisco, who's the federal marshal, she's described as kind of like this tall blonde lady in the novel, whereas she's Jennifer Lopez in the book. Buddy, the sidekick to Jack Foley, the fellow bank robber, is they're just two white Florida guys in the novel, and in the movie it's Ving Rhames playing Buddy, and Jack Foley is of course George Clooney. So yeah, it's strange because even though I was reading these descriptions, I sort of blanked those out. It's
Yep.
just I'm picturing Ving Rhames.
I kept
Um,
thinking of Buddy Repperton from Christine.
you know what?
Not the movie version. I just kept thinking like of his name when I was
But
reading it.
but you know what? It's strange. If you read the novel and you've never seen the film before, if you've got that in your head, I could imagine seeing the Buddy character kind of looking like Buddy Repperton.
Yep.
Just that kind of not that he's like a hood like Buddy Repperton was in Christine, but just that kind of like long sideburns, looks kind of rough, looks like he's been in a jail a few times, even though he's a high school student in Christine. But back on point. So the novel, well, the movie, I'll speak about that first. George Clooney plays a guy who's a bank robber, and we see him getting busted because he gets into a car that doesn't work. The cops surround him, and he goes off to jail. He robs the bank as his kind of his MO without using a gun. He just uses his charm and a little bit of deception. He convinces the bank teller that the two people having like a banking business meeting across the floor, one of them is his associate, and if he gives him the wrong signal, he's going to shoot the bank manager in the face. So it's a weird mixture and a great way to open the film, because you're watching something that if this were happening in real life, it'd be horrifying. And the actress who plays the bank teller, I think, does a great job, because you can tell she's getting kind of nervous and flustered because she's worried about herself and the people in the bank. And Clooney's just there, like with his kind of hangdog charm. And you're like, I love this scene, even though I shouldn't, because it's, he's committing a terrible crime. He goes to jail. While in jail, we kind of get these flashbacks and flash forwards to his time in various prisons and the people that he meets there. And it turns out one of them is a guy named Glenn Michaels, played by Steve Zahn in the movie, who's this kind of like weird, like California surfer guy, kind of with these sunglasses he never takes off. He has wind of a big job, big heist, a house robbery that he could perform back in Detroit if he had the right crew once they got out, because there's a Bernie Madoff type of corporate grifter who's in the slammer with them, who claims to have all this money. In the film, it's diamonds, I think, but in the novel, it's just a lot of cash stored at his house. So everyone's like, okay, once we get out of here, we'll go to Detroit, we'll make off with the millions, and we can retire comfortably or whatever they want to do. Also inside, they meet some pretty tough guys led by Snoopy, who's a boxer and a criminal sort of mastermind in the movie, played by Don Cheadle, who gets involved in the heist, much to the chagrin of everybody else, because he's the unstable, like dangerous element to the story that the other guys are like, look, we could just go in, get the money and get out. Snoopy and his crew are much more into say violence, murder, and sexual assault, which gives the book its flavor, and then the movie too. During a prison break, Karen Sisco, played by Jennifer Lopez, is the federal marshal who is there to process somebody else at the jail, but she witnesses a bunch of people plopping up out of the ground on the other side of the fence. She pulls out her shotgun to take action. She gets fooled by Jack Foley, who's disguised himself as a prison guard. She gets taken hostage. They both end up in the trunk of the stolen car together. And yeah, Clooney and Lopez have a moment. And once that moment is over, they can't stop thinking about each other. So the story becomes this heist that's in the works, and these two people are on opposite sides of the law who just want to have a chance to meet under different circumstances to see if there might actually be a romantic spark. I think the movie is charming and dangerous, funny and kind of sad. The novel is, I think, much more removed. I don't know. I felt like even having read the book, there's something about the performances in the film that really underscore the themes that Leonard was trying to go for. I'm done rambling. I just wanted to set that up because it occurs to me that, and perhaps for good reason, I rarely set up these things in the beginning of the show. But Cole, what did you make about A Sight?
I loved it. And here's this lofty claim that I was going to make. At first, my thought was going to be, I think this is probably the most faithful adaptation we have watched to date, and it's not close. My second, this sort of then evolved into my second thought, which is, I think I like this movie better than the book. Um, that is obviously very rare. There are receipts all over kicking the seat. I think the only like adaptation, quote unquote, that even comes close to being this good is Space Odyssey, and that's a whole different case because Clark wrote the novel while they were making the movie. So I don't even know if you can count it, you know? I
It's
think
faithful in
that,
spirit, I think, because the novel and the film are very different from, just going off the POV
right,
of the monkeys in the beginning. Yeah.
right. So I'm talking specifically where like the movie might be better than the book. I think
Yeah.
that with 2001, they're equal parts of the same half to or of the same whole to me. Um, this I watched the movie and I kind of felt the same way as you, where there's this thing about crime novels for me that I wrote this in my review of the book, which you can find at thequilltolive.com. They're kind of a palate cleanser for a reader like me because most of my reading is like meditative dives into epic fantasy worlds. Like I want big, deep stuff, and I don't care if the plot is slow as all hell. Like I just need character moments and growth and development and just seeping in this world. Whereas when you take a crime novel, especially one written to take place in our world, the real world, um, all of that world building is done for us. Presumably a reader understands the world. They don't need to like hear about how it works and what systems make it go. So a crime novel has this sort of freedom to exist in such a space of plot. And Leonard does a fairly good job of characterizing folks, but he does kind of like a Stephen King approach where you hear like a few things about each character and that kind of like solidifies them in your mind as the reader. And you're now like, okay, I understand who this is. I can fill in the blanks. Where a fantasy novel would do something completely different and kind of tell you all these details because, again, that fleshes out the world. So, what that does is sort of sets the character development and like the slow burn elements of a book aside and makes it just a page turner. And I think this is why so many people love crime and thriller books, and I'm not the first person to have this idea or understand this concept by any means. But Out of Sight felt like that to me. I read it about a month and a half ago, 300 some pages, and I was just kind of like flying through it. And there's such crisp dialogue and like plot movement in it, and you don't feel like any characters are being left behind per se. It just feels like they aren't necessarily the focus. And that's completely fine and dandy for a book to do, especially a crime novel, which is kind of my whole point here. But then I watched the movie and I was like, Soderbergh and the actors understand these characters on the same level that I believe Elmore Leonard did, if not more. And they exude this sort of like charm and understanding of the story. And it actually helped me understand the book more because, to be honest, I read the book and I was like, this sort of love story kind of through line doesn't really like ring true with me, doesn't really feel like that great. But in the movie, I got it. It clicked. I was like, there is chemistry between these two people beyond just the author telling me there is chemistry between these two people. you know, I bought it. I was like, yes, this makes sense. I gotta hand it to George Clooney and J Lo. Like, I usually find it hard to see J Lo as a character and not as J Lo. Like, she's one of those actors I just can't usually get past that barrier. Not a problem here. I felt like she understood Karen Sisco, and she understood that like even Karen Sisco doesn't completely understand Karen Sisco, and Jack Foley is the person who brings that out in her. Um, so now I'm done rambling, but this is all my evidence stacking up to tell you that like this movie is excellent. Um, I'm glad I read the book. I always am glad to read the book before I watch any adaptation. But this is one of those rare instances where it brought it to life in a way that the book didn't for me. And the last thing I'll say is Ving Rhames and Don Cheadle, Chef's Kiss, my two favorite actors in the movie, unquestionably, and that's a high bar considering Clooney and J Lo and all the other people in this movie, quite frankly, are excellent. So, yeah, I loved it all around, and I think had I watched this movie in a vacuum, I probably wouldn't have loved it all that much, like 7.5. But having watched it after reading the book, 8.5, 9 probably, just a lot of fun. Really enjoyed it, and I think it understands what it set out to do. It doesn't bend beyond that scope, but it kind of plays really nicely within it.
Very well said.
And
I do,
verbose.
but yes, but that's the theme of today's show. We are definitely not Elmore Leonarding this discussion because he is very breezy, and that's not to denigrate him. He just knows how to write in a compelling, almost a cinematic approach, like scene to scene to scene, and it all ties together. One thing that I think one of the reasons I really responded to this movie when I was 21 is because it came out in 1998. It's 4 years removed from Pulp Fiction, but Quentin Tarantino was very much in the zeitgeist still. I think this is like a year after Jackie Brown, and he'd had a number of. He was like the hot filmmaker of the time, and so Jackie Brown, which I don't know if you have you seen that one, the
Mm-mm.
Tarantino. Okay, we'll have to watch that at some point because that's a movie that when I first saw it, I hated it because I'm like, it was directed by Tarantino, but it wasn't written by him. And I felt this shows like I don't understand this. What's this weird crime story? I guess he's got some of his recurring actors, but I watched it again about 15 years later and I finally got it. Do you know who wrote Jackie Brown?
Elmore Leonard.
Elmore Leonard.
I was gonna
And
say
what
Bret Easton Ellis is a joke.
no. That would be interesting. But but the point of this is, and it really was solidified watching Out of Sight again, is this was the perfect era for that movie to come out because in 95 or maybe it was 96, there was another film that came out, an Elmore Leonard adaptation called Get Shorty, starring John Travolta.
Mm-hmm.
And John Travolta was a year or so out of his renaissance because of Pulp Fiction, because of Tarantino. So Tarantino films and Elmore Leonard adaptations coming out at this time, they almost feel like they're part of the same multiverse. They don't really connect, but you have a lot of the actors showing up in, across kind of cross platform, if you will. And so at the end of Out of Sight, when Jack Foley has been, Karen Sisco, spoilers, folks, shoots Jack in the leg and forces him to go back to prison because, towards the end of the novel and the movie to some extent, he's like adamant about not going back. He's saying he will die, he will be shot down by Snoopy or the cops or whoever rather than go back to prison again because he's looking at a 30-year sentence without parole. She shoots him. He gets dragged into the back of the paddy wagon. And the film, excuse me, Karen Sisco's in the front seat, Jack's in the back, and someone else gets into the back. And it's a bit that was written for the movie, not the novel, because they end very differently. It's Samuel L. Jackson. He comes in for a 3-minute scene. And back in 1998, especially for Tarantino geeks like me, that was like catnip. Like, it's not like Sam Jackson now where he's, fucking hawking credit cards or something. It was like, oh my God, this is the coolest man on earth. And he's coming in to have a really impactful little scene because, the story is going to continue and it means the characters have sort of evolved past where they were the last time we saw them together. I like this ending a lot more than the one in the book because the book ending it's kind of dark. Jack just gets, first of all, Buddy does not survive the big house heist. And when I read that in the book, I'm like, wait, that can't be right. He's going to get up. No, he's dead. And Jack gets shot and sent away to, prison. And it's just Karen and her dad kind of having a phone call. And the last line of the book, I think, is "That's my girl, the tough babe," which is, I think, a great theme in the novel that is woven into the film, but not as obnoxiously so as in the book, which is the whole idea of Karen Sisco is a female, law officer, and it's an all boys club, and she's got all these kind of barriers of what people think of her, is really driven home in the novel in a way that Soderbergh and I guess the screenwriter of the movie found ways to incorporate, and you get that sense, but it's done very subtly, which I kind of appreciated.
Yeah, I think that we get a version of this type of character that has already dealt with a lot of that shit. And I'm not saying she doesn't struggle or suffer from discrimination, but it feels like she has like built herself up to combat it, which is a terrible thing to have to do as a character and as a person. And you can see that wear and tear on kind of her psyche because she doesn't like express herself a ton. She kind of has to stay really locked in. And I appreciated that element of the story because so many other similar narratives would just show us a character who's just beginning to deal with this, and wouldn't show us kind of the battle hardened, like put together version of somebody who has decided this is what I'm going to do about it. What comes to mind for me is like Silence of the Lambs, you know, the
Mm-hmm.
Jodie Foster's character is kind of struggling with that early on, and we kind of get that struggle. Completely worthwhile story to tell. But you have to inject something new into it. And I think Silence of the Lambs does it well, but I think it's a good example of like a juxtaposition between a character who is further along in a particular journey of being a minority and having to deal with discrimination in a very male dominated field, which I just find fascinating. Particularly given the industry I come from, you know, it's very male centric, and I have to be hyper conscious of, you know, the folks I work with, and I try to give them a voice and let them speak up. So it's interesting to see how that plays out, even in a fictional world. And I really did appreciate all of that.
Well, I think
Yeah,
there's also there's a bit of a balance there because it's not a one-dimensional cartoon, like I think you see in a lot of sort of
right.
modern takes on this kind of this battle, where you've got the tough as nails woman, and she's up against this, patriarchal authority structure, but all the men are pigs and they're obstacles and they suck. And the woman has had to masculize herself to the point of almost being a man to break down those barriers. The thing that's kind of eye-opening about Karen Sisco is, and this is also written, the novel was written like 27 or 28 years ago. It was very short between the publication of the book and the time the movie came out. But you almost had this more balanced version of the tough female character where Karen Sisco is very clever. She does have male allies, in the various, police contacts that she has, whether on the FBI or the local police. But she's also still a very kind of feminine woman who's not afraid to fall in love. And she admits that she's got this fault of falling for bad boys. But she's also very committed to her job and she's very good at her job. And it didn't occur to me until I think after the film was over, I think I looked up Jennifer Lopez's age. I think she was 28 when she made this. And Karen Sisco in the book, they don't say how old she is. They don't say how old she
I
is.
think
The
they say
character is
she's
in the
around
film.
30.
Did she? Okay, I missed that.
I'm
But
almost certain.
but she seems like, maybe I don't want to discriminate, but it just seems like I think of a 28 or a 30-year-old today, and I don't necessarily think of someone who is as put together
Right.
as Karen
I
Sisco
mean,
is.
look at me.
You're also not in law enforcement, or are you, Jack
That's
Foley?
fair.
No,
I'm just Foley, actually.
sorry, just
Um,
Foley.
yeah, and I'm in taco law enforcement. It's a very niche field, up and coming, they say.
That also
Um,
sounds like it's not family friendly.
yeah, right.
Gotta inspect
um,
those tacos. Sorry.
you bring up a cool point because I think that her Karen's interactions with people are really nuanced in J Lo's performance. And one of my favorite scenes in the entire movie is Michael Keaton as Ray, her like boyfriend slash lover. Um, the guy walks in, and like credit to Michael Keaton, you just know he's a fucking low life, no good, like fucking, dirty fucking cop who just like all he cares about is his job. He doesn't really care about her. Um, and it's such an interesting foil. Like, I love that you kind of have this spectrum of we know Jack Foley is a quote unquote bad person, but like both Elmore Leonard and Soderbergh and Clooney, like they give us reason to root for him because he's the one that doesn't kill. He's the one that doesn't resort to violence. He just takes money. And that's actually like a surprisingly relevant message today. It's kind of like a Robin Hoodie, like anti-capitalist take, he's just like, oh, he's just stealing from the banks who have all the money. Like, not to say that it's a victimless crime. It definitely like, has victims. But I think that's kind of the in for us to like him. He's charming, but like he'll screw you out of your money. Whereas Michael Keaton, you can just tell he's an ass. Um, and he might be quote unquote good, by every book definition of it. Um, but even his interactions with her, like her dad, and her dad even can tell that she's kind of enamored with Foley, and he hasn't even like met the guy. there's, I don't know, there's kind of like this sixth sense that permeates the movie where like everybody knows like something's up here, but it just kind of works. The chemistry just kind of like exists for a reason. And I really think that's hard to pull off. And I have to give credit to every single person in the movie, because what they do is they throw other relationships at us, and they allow us to like measure the main relationship of Foley and Karen against those other ones. Like, it's funny because Foley and Buddy have this really good rapport. They're just like good guy friends, you know, they kind of get along, and they, when they clash, it's always friendly and they come to a conclusion together. And then you have Glenn, who's just like a complete and utter idiot, and Foley just has no time for his foolishness. Um, so when he meets Karen, it's like, what's interesting is he has that kind of rapport with her like he does with Buddy, but it's obviously more of a romantic flair. Um, and he knows that like the good streak in him could very well like fall for her, but it won't work because there's the kind of that one asterisk. And we see that playing in every single relationship, and I just think it's so like, it's so well written and performed. Like everything just kind of melds together in a perfect way in the movie. There's not like one weak point that I can find. Um, and it's exactly like we were mentioning earlier, you know, it's, the movie captures everybody so well, and these characters are not one dimensional. And listen, when you tell me we're watching a crime movie from 1998, I'm expecting one dimensional, like, you know, especially after coming off of Scarface. Like, it, you know, it was a very particular film. It was very good, but the characters were a very particular type of thing, and a lot of them were kind of caricature-esque in their archetypes.
Sure.
That can work, but I think this is just such an interesting and unique take, and it was so unexpected for me, and I think that's why I loved it so much.
Well, first of all, I had a point that I forgot to make about Jackie Brown, because I got to rambling as I do. But one of the cool things about that movie is it's an Elmore Leonard novel that Tarantino adapted for the big screen, and Ray Nicolette is a character in that book, and he shows up in the movie. He's got more of a substantial role. He's also played by Michael Keaton. So that movie came out in 97. Out of Sight is 98. So when he pops onto the screen, I don't think I knew about Elmore Leonard or whatever, but I'd seen Jackie Brown. And even though I didn't care for the movie at the time, I was like, holy shit, it's the same character and the same actor. So yeah, again, it gets into that sort of shared universe.
The Elmore Leonard Cinematic Universe, the ELCU.
I would much rather spend time there than some other cinematic universes. But no, like what I want to kind of get into as well in terms of the characterization is you've got a big spectrum of, you know, likable characters who are more romantic, and then you've got the real dangerous ones. And this is one of those rare kind of action comedy romances, if you can even describe. I don't even know what genre this is, except for, you know, light crime. But
I mean, genre is a complete sham anyway.
Yes. What? Anyway, no, but it's kind of going along. Again, you've got a bank robber who robs banks without a gun. Everything is kind of like jokey and cool. There's a lot of, you know, Soderbergh-esque transitions and kind of like effects. At one point I was watching this with my wife, and she hadn't seen it I don't think she'd seen it at all, or at least not for a long time. So there were these frequent like slowdowns or freeze frames. And at one point she asked me towards the end of the movie, she's like, is something wrong with our Blu-ray player? I'm like, no, that's just Soderbergh.
I had the same thought. I was like, wait, is something, because there were some that were very obvious, and there were some that were just like very subtle and quick. And I was like, what? Like, is this a broken DVD? Like Willy Wonka one that basically set my DVD player on fire?
Wow.
It didn't actually, but it came close.
That's a story.
Yeah, there was smoke involved.
Oh, gross toasted marshmallows. But no, but my point is, it's kind of going along, and you think it's kind of this like light comedy, even though it involves like, you know, hardened criminals and stuff. But then even the introduction of Snoopy Maurice Miller, played by Don Cheadle, as a boxer, and Jack is talking to Buddy. They're watching this prison, you know, boxing match, and he's like, you know why they call him Snoopy? It's because if you pet him, he goes down. It basically makes all his money, you know, throwing fights in jail. And so you think, okay, it's Don Cheadle. he played a good guy in Boogie Nights like the year before. Something about the late 90s. Everything was just coming together. And he was a likable character in that. And you first see him and, he's in the boxing ring. He kind of has this like almost like a Snoopy dog like expression when he's trying to signal to the other guy, like, this is the part where you punch me and I go down. A few scenes later, after the guy who quote unquote won that fight is bragging in the yard to all of his friends about how he kicked Snoopy's ass, there's a line of prisoners walking, in formation, and all of a sudden Snoopy and his, kind of sidekick come up alongside the guy and they just shiv him repeatedly in the chest. And there's blood like flying out of these little holes in his chest in his uniform. And the guy falls down and there's a freeze frame of him like choking to death on his own blood. You're like, oh yes, that's what kind of movie this is. It's going to get really serious and kind of funny and charming.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, and I think that dichotomy is really important to play with, because you have to offset the sort of like, I want to root for Jack Foley with this is the world in which he lives. Because otherwise Karen's uncertainty doesn't really work. I think if this was a straight rom-com, like, they fall in love very quickly, and everything just goes fine, but that can't happen. That's not what Out of Sight is about. And I think it has a really interesting message, which is that like people's paths can cross at like the wrong time or even in the wrong lifetime. And it's sort of, you kind of just have to deal with it. And it reminds me of like when I first met Erin, she had a boyfriend and I had to chisel away at the statue in the marble, just kind of waiting, and seeing if, the time would be right. And luckily, eventually it was. And I think that the movie resonated with me on that level. It's interesting to see two characters who are so enamored with one another also struggle with their other priorities in life. And I think that's an important message too. Like, some people will care more about their career or their passions, and relationships won't be at the front of their mind. But then when someone comes along, they're like, oh shit, now I have to reevaluate. And you made a comment earlier where these characters, they end up in a place where they weren't before. And I think that was really resonant for me, because a lot of the movies we have watched, not necessarily lately, but just in general, like we've seen a lot of mob movies and such, and it's kind of like a character starts here and then it's just, just a descent into madness or violence or whatever, which I do think is an interesting story. But this one is sort of like a reflection of actual growth, which is kind of an ebb and flow. It's more of like a wave, and it shows kind of the ups and downs. And to do that in such a deft way and in such a focused story just feels really masterful to me. The more I think about it, the more I'm like, this movie just hits on all the right notes. And I think it also does a really good job of taking the scenes from the book and like playing with them cinematically in a really interesting way. The scene that comes to mind is Karen Sisco drinking in the hotel before Jack Foley shows up, and the businessmen kind of come and flirt with her. It feels like such a cookie cutter scene, but then when you really dive in, you're like, I've never really seen anything like this. She just like, it's kind of ahead of its time, because she politely tells them to back off, and they do. Which I was like, okay, I can appreciate that. And she doesn't do it by saying like, I'm a federal marshal, whatever. She's just like, please, no, thank you. And it just like, that felt so much more real to me than, kind of like a half-baked joke from a rom-com. So I think that's where that kind of genre melding comes into play, is it creates something that's more real. Like, life does not have a genre. So when you create a movie that kind of defies those boundaries, it becomes so much more relatable on so many different levels.
Yeah, I mean, it really is a
My life is a noir film.
Really?
I monologue in a smoky room all the time.
And your wife is trying to kill you to collect some kind of money.
They call me colloquy.
This show is over. No,
I think I've got some gum on my shoe.
Oh God. But no, the genre thing is interesting, because this is something that also, this is my theme of like I watched the movie for the first time in 20 years, and it finally clicked on all these different levels I hadn't appreciated before, even though I loved it the first time or the first dozen times. It's such a romantic movie. Like you alluded to this, or you led up to it. At one point, Karen is in a bar in Detroit because she's kind of followed Jack and the various underworld figures from their escape in Florida all the way up to Detroit. And she knows something's going on, but she doesn't have a bead on what the big heist or what the big score is. So she's staying at this big fancy hotel. These, I think it's 2 or 3 business jagoffs are kind of almost like making bets on who can pick her up, and they do this little gross like finger snap like handoff, when one guy bombs out and the other guy's, he's up. And then Jack comes in. He's the third guy playing with the rule of 3, and they sit down and they have this kind of this banter, like they're going to pretend that they're other people for a few minutes, but then they get down to brass tacks, like, are we really going to do this? What happens later? Let's not think about that. But just that chemistry against the sparkling lights of the snow and over the city through the window, it's an iconic image, but it's also just so, like, it's so hot. Like they go back to the hotel room and they have sex and everything, and there's kind of like a strip tease, like they're both, Clooney's down to his boxers and she's getting down to her lingerie, but it's just so erotic and sensual, and you really feel these characters like figuring out, we didn't know if we liked each other, if it was just like the excitement of the moment in that car trunk. No, we really do at least like each other, at least care about each other, but we're possibly in love, and we're gonna culminate that. You don't expect that in the same kind of movie that ends with a guy going up the stairs to shoot another guy, tripping and falling, and his brains splatter all over the place.
Yeah, the moment when they're stripping down is a little bit funny to me because, first of all, J-Lo and George Clooney both 10s as far as I'm concerned. Like, can't get two hotter people to star in a movie together.
J-Lo might be a 16, especially 1998 J-Lo. Yes.
But she like strips down and she has this beautiful like bra and underwear on, and then George Clooney has like white boxer briefs, and it just looks so schleppy, but like, I mean, he makes it work, don't get me wrong, but I definitely laughed. I was like, god damn it, he still makes, like, if I wore that I would look like a big baby in a diaper, and George Clooney it just looks like a perfect model.
Well, he also does that kind of like almost like a little shrug, like,
yep. Yeah, he's just like, this is what you get, right? Yeah, I mean, we've kind of circled the drain on this, but like, genre is the thing that frustrates me a lot. And not so much in film. I'm learning a lot about like film genre and like how it can be played with and within, particularly in this movie. But like in books, a lot of times people use genre as like an excuse not to like something they haven't tried. The same, I think, goes for music. I mean, I have an album club, and a lot of people, like, when a country album comes up, they'll be like, "Oh, I hate country. This is a 2 for me." And I'm like, "Well, did you like the music you heard?" Like, because what genre it is doesn't really matter if you liked it, right? Like, why are you saying I liked this, but it's country, so it gets a lower rating? And I think the same thing goes with books. Like, a lot of people view fantasy as a lesser genre, or if it's not literary fiction, they're not going to read it.
right.
And I do think that genre can be helpful in categorization. Like, there are some things I read that they're just fantasy. They are. I'm not going to lie. But I think that using it as an excuse or as a shield or as a cage is a problem. And I think when stories break out of that mold, and maybe they exist within the Venn diagram overlap of certain genres, but they still kind of break out of one single thing, that's when they really succeed. And that's what I think about this movie in particular. It has the crime element, it has the romance, it has the comedy. It doesn't say it needs to be this all the way through. And we've been talking about Tarantino, like, he has moments of levity, he has moments of comedy. He doesn't just keep his everything has a purpose that isn't just it has to fit within this genre with Tarantino. I would argue that he defies genre more than almost anybody. It's incredibly hard to pinpoint. And then you look at a movie like the Fast series, and they're like pure action.
How dare you? Why
right?
Why are you bringing that up?
I haven't even seen Fast 10, so who knows? But I don't know. It's something that kind of gets on my nerves a little bit. It's like I think genre can be a helpful tool if you're literally just trying to classify something, but if you're using it as a justification for how you feel about the thing, you get into troublesome territory. And I think a movie like this kind of proves my point. If you say, "Oh, like I didn't really like this movie. I'm not a big crime fan." I'm like, "Well, then did you really understand what the movie was?" Um, I guess it's genre as a lens doesn't so much work. It's more like the Dewey Decimal System. It's kind of like a guideline for how you can understand like the large pantheon of content, but it isn't the end all be all of what everything is. I hope I'm making some sort of sense. I get a little angry rambly when I talk about genre.
No, I mean, I understand, and I'm there with you most of the way. It's something that I don't think I've thought about as deeply as you have, but it's frustrating because I will watch certain films and feel like they break out of, the genre they're in, or the, oh my gosh, there's a word I'm thinking of and I can't think. We'll stick with genre, but the tone, that's the word I'm looking
Yep.
for, tone. They're like, oh, well, that breaks the movie breaks its tone halfway through, and some people are like, well, maybe it's supposed to. I'm like, well, yeah, there are cases where it works, and there are other cases where it doesn't, and it's almost a cheat, like they wanted to achieve something but they faked the bridge to get there. I think Out of Sight is a perfect example of a movie that is consistently its own thing. There are no false beats, but you will swing from, a funny bit about Jack talking about how he's going to stomp on Glenn's sunglasses, and maybe he won't even take them off first, to a montage that is much more horrifically outlined in the novel. But in the book, I think, or in the film, it's tastefully done as a close-up montage of Snoop and Glenn and the crew going into like basically a crack den and murdering a whole bunch of people. Uh, the effect, it's almost like Glenn making his bones with that crew, like to prove that he's can ride with them to do this bigger heist, because people might die, and just to make sure that he understands what kind of folks he's dealing with. They're not going to take kindly to Glenn cheating them or cutting out on the deal. But yeah, in the novel, there's a rape scene and a murder scene and a partial murder scene that ends kind of ambiguously, and all of this stuff. In the movie, you get a lot of close-ups, a lot of kind of montage, and you see the aftermath a few scenes later when Karen Sisco is on the scene with some other detectives, but it's not like poured over in grisly detail necessarily.
Mhm.
You don't really think of those two elements, jokey comedy and horrifying violence in the same film. I think Tarantino, like Soderbergh in some of his movies, and maybe this is one of them, are almost in the Tarantino genre. I think Tarantino has to be his own genre, and other
Yep.
things can be swept up in that.
Oh, absolutely. I like when content or a story can lull you into a sense of one thing and then kind of rip you out, but you feel less whiplash from it. You feel good. You feel like you have kind of been like jolted awake a little bit. This is going to be a really weird connection, but have you ever seen the sketch show I Think You Should Leave on Netflix?
No, I don't think
So
so.
it's by Tim Robinson and it is hilarious. And he used to write for SNL. He has a bunch of like alums on it. And it's like very funny. I cannot express how hilarious it is. But there's one sketch where it starts off as like a spine medicine commercial, and it features somebody like, I can play with my dog again, and she like throws the ball, and then this guy's like, I can pick up my grandkids again, and he picks up a kid, and then this guy goes, I can finally get my money back from Robbie blah 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 at the recording studio. And then it diverges into this scene where he's like fighting with this like clearly scam artist recording guy, and for like 3 minutes he ends up recording a new song. He's finally got a beat that's going to make him a star, and you completely forget that it was a spine medicine commercial for like 5 minutes. And then at the very end, they show you the label of the medication. You're kind of like, oh shit, like this was what the sketch started as. And you completely, like, you just feel kind of invigorated. And that's what these moments do for me in stories. Like, and it's a feeling I get a lot in video games too. Like you think that one thing is going to happen gameplay wise, but then something else does, and you get a new ability and they do something really new and unique with it. And it's like that feeling of novelty. And for me, film has historically been like the medium that captures that the least for me. And I think a lot of that is due to my own shortcomings. Like I would only really see like the big Marvel movies, and I don't watch a ton of movies, but in doing this with you, I start to see the types of stories that I would have sought out had like film been my main medium growing up. And I think that's really cool when something can kind of bring you into one zone and say, exist here for a second, and then kind of just like rip you over to another, and you're like, oh, like this is new and fun. It's just a really interesting and like invigorating and adrenaline fueled feeling. And it's hard to replicate. So when a movie that I'd like thought I was gonna not really like captures that, it's delightful. I feel tickled.
Well, it's fun because we're talking a bit about genre here and how Tarantino kind of crosses over a lot. I'm thinking of Soderbergh and also the Coen brothers. They are more so than Tarantino, because Tarantino, even though he puts a lot of different aspects into his movie, he is primarily a crime guy or an underworld figure guy, which makes me very eager and curious about his latest movie. I don't know if you saw the announcement, but I
The
think it
Movie
came out.
Critic,
The Movie Critic. It's about
and you're
apparently
starring in it, from what I understand.
I joked to Earth's Mightiest Critics. I said, I think Tarantino's making his last movie for us. I don't think I got any response in my Facebook message. I think people might be like, he can keep it. But no, it's I guess it's about a guy who wrote like film reviews. It's based on someone that Tarantino actually grew up reading, apparently. It takes place in 1977. It's a guy who wrote like movie reviews in a porno magazine. So I'm all there for it. But my point is, Tarantino kind of has his wheelhouse. Even Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is centered around one of the most famous crimes in history, the Tate murders. But you look at Soderbergh and you look at the Coen brothers, and they're very hard to pin down in terms of genre. Because I was looking up Steven Soderbergh's filmography. We talk about Out of Sight. We talked about the Ocean's movies. He also did Aaron Brockovich. He did Traffic. He went on this jag in the early 2000s where he was doing like micro budget kind of like indie films, one called Bubble, another one called The Girlfriend Experience, which was turned into a TV show later. So he's a guy who can cross different genres and also different scales of movie making, maybe these multi-million-dollar movie star studded spectaculars, and then go do something really indie and have it be as cool and impactful. And the Coen brothers are the same thing. They'll do Raising Arizona, this crazy Nicolas Cage comedy from 1987, and they'll do No Country for Old Men, 20 years later, which is a hard-hitting, bleak crime drama, and everything in between. So that's kind of why I'm not a snooty film critic, but I expect a lot from movies because I have seen what really talented, ambitious filmmakers can do with a movie. So when I go to see something that's a remake, I'm like, well, why bother? Don't
Right.
spend $250 million remaking The Little Mermaid. Give 25 filmmakers $10 million or whatever the math ends up to make something interesting and slap the Disney label on it. It can be done, and it should be done. And movies like Out of Sight, I watched this, I'm like, why don't I see films like this anymore? 25 years later, you'd think that we would have advanced beyond, but we've been stuck in comic book movie land, and that's not a slam in the whole genre, but it is a sense that we lost something, because it was a big Universal movie. Universal Pictures put this out, and you wouldn't see this today.
Yeah, I mean, there's no world right now in which like a movie would be happy with like a decent profit. Everything has to be maximized to ultimate growth to better whatever company is making it, and that is definitely kind of sad. And it also, like, that's why we're getting so many adaptations. They need an existing property that they know people will come to see. And it's especially heartbreaking for somebody like me who's like just starting to really appreciate what movies can do, because I'm not getting a lot of like really new original stuff. I actually feel lucky with some of the stuff we've got, like Everything Everywhere All at Once, Marcel the Shell, two great examples. I think A24 is doing great stuff from what I've seen. Enter Galactic was a great one. Like, it just kind of made use of that Into the Spider-Verse animation style, told a really cool story about Black love and New York City and creativity. And so it's fun that I can find these things, but like, I wonder, is that sort of art dying out, or will we reach a tipping point where that stuff just isn't going to get made because it's not going to make enough money. It would only make it would only make 20 million instead of 200, like it's just kind of sad that that's the state of the world. And I think an understated sort of like really well developed movie like Out of Sight is so hard to replicate nowadays. And that kind of brings me to a point of like with a book, it all kind of hinges on the author. Like I know there's an editor involved and other such things, but like with a movie, you have a million different cooks in the kitchen. And when they all agree on the dish they're making and you get an Out of Sight, it's like, again, I feel delighted. I feel happy that this happened at this level of quality. This very easily could have been a really, really shitty movie. And it just completely abolished all of my expectations from the first scene.
Yeah, it did that Tarantino thing where the movie opens on one scene and very kind of like the freeze frame images of George Clooney having some kind of a meltdown, in the street, and you're like, what's going on here? And then we got the bank robbery, and then later on we go back to the scene that led up to that involves the characters that we hadn't seen for a while, like, oh, I guess this is what happened to that Wall Street guy after he got out of prison. He became very successful. He kind of threw Jack Foley a bone for being, for watching over him in prison, but Jack wasn't having the pittance of a job that he was offering, which, watching this movie at 21 and then watching it again at 45, it's not that I like Dick the Ripper, played by Albert Brooks, who we've talked about before on the show, but he's in a bad wig and a bad toothpiece. But it's interesting because I could see both sides of that encounter in his office, because when Jack gets out of prison, he goes to visit Dick the Ripper at his fancy corporate office, and because he's been promised a job once they get out, and he goes in and basically Clooney is fitted for a security guard's outfit. He storms into Dick's office and says, "Look, I protected you, and what is this?" and all this other stuff. When I first saw it, I was like, "Yeah, you stick it to him." But now watching, I'm like, Dick the Ripper is, he's a jerk. He's ripped off a bunch of people and somehow found his way to weasel into another position of power and money. But he is kind of right. Jack doesn't have any marketable skills. He's very good at, robbing banks and getting out of prison. But in terms of having to prove himself in the straight job corporate real world, there's nothing wrong with saying, here. And he says this, he said, look, I was going to put you in a job, in security. You prove yourself there, and then we see what you can do inside the organization. Jack wasn't having it. And I don't know if it's because he was expecting to be like thrust into a high paid, high powered position, which that could almost be another movie, like the bank robber turned like middle management guy. Like, how does he swim in that environment? But yeah, I was watching it and seeing that scene a completely different way than I did, 25 years ago.
I watched it in a completely different way. I was like, yeah, you fucking tell him, Jack. Like you don't need that stupid ass job. And I think the reason I felt that way is they did such a really good job of building tension. And it's not like, action movie violence tension. It's sort of the tension of like the burden of responsibility of that kind of corporate 9 to 5. And like I'm obviously in a different situation. Like I don't like I don't have a corporate job and I like don't ever want one again. I understand that there may be a time where I have to take up that mantle, to support a family or do whatever. But I saw like the kind of flashes to like the little toys on the desk and like the clocks and all the kind of like accoutrement of a corporate job. And I was like, that makes me want to die inside. And I understand why Jack is like, even if I succeed at this security job, that's my goal. Like, no, I'm out. So while I understand from a pragmatic perspective that, like, yeah, you've been in jail multiple times, all you do is rob banks, this is the job you want. I also have respect for the character just being like, no, because it's a movie and like we don't need him to accept the job, otherwise we don't really have a movie. But I completely understand where you're coming from. It's a moment where a movie that feels very real sometimes has to like eschew reality a little bit and say we're going to do something a little bit different. And he kind of speaks for a lot of people, I think, who they think their offer is one thing and it's completely different and much worse. And they got a bad lot. So he kind of lets out the anger of the masses, as it were.
Well, I think yeah, don't get me wrong. I'm on both sides of this issue. You know, I understand Dick's position, but I also understand Jack's position. And with Jack, you know, doing that little outburst, we get a great, and we don't see this much from Clooney anymore. I kind of miss it, but early in his career, one of the things that helped him make his bones beyond the Caesar haircut he rocked on ER, along with that, almost like he had a broken neck thing. Like he kind of does it in Out of Sight, but he's like, you know, kind of has his head down a lot. But he did these great meltdowns, these indignant rage, like monologues, like in ER and in this movie and a couple other films that really, he's great at just letting that out. What's interesting though is that he notices the details of that bank, the office manager's desk, like the little trinkets that, you know, his lunch is like a yogurt and a tab or whatever it is. He's, you can see he's bothered by it, but it's not until he realizes that he's going to be a security guard that the indignity sets in. Like, I'm not even going to be good enough to be the middle manager having a suck job of a nothing lunch and, you know, probably just pressing keys all day. I got to sit on a stool. So you almost think if this guy had offered him another middle management job, he would have reluctantly taken that. But yeah, it's just like there's
Well, that's
Dick
like
the Ripper, there's Dick the Ripper, there's the middle manager, and then there's the security guard. And Jack was willing to sell his soul for the middle manager thing, but just barely.
So speaking from experience, it is very easy to fake a middle manager job and do very, very little. I have done it, and I would do it again. I much prefer my current job because I actually do something I enjoy, and I am paid very specifically for the work that I do. It's not a nebulous thing. So I think that Jack probably saw like I could fake it till I make it. And like this is a very similar thing to bank robbing. It's he can use his charm to kind of get where he needs to go. And I think he sees those like boring kind of images as a motivator to be like, I can get to where this guy is using the skills I have. He knows that. But if he's stuck on a stool checking people in and greeting them, that's not going to happen for him. And I
Well,
think that's
at least not in a timeline that he can probably
right.
accept, because it's something I hadn't even thought about. But there's that scene in the prison yard earlier, I think, where he's looking around and seeing all the old men, the like the lifers, and it's just how sad and kind of broken down they are. They're just playing chess, they're bored. And that's why he's like, I can't go back to prison for 30 years. That's not going to be me. But you can almost see him seeing that security job of like, yes, I might have potential upward mobility, but it's still just another sentence. Am I going to be doing that for 2 years, 3 years before I maybe get recognized? Or is this just going to be another lifetime of sitting around doing nothing?
Right. Yeah. A corporate prison or real prison. Take your pick.
I think we just broke open Out of Sight. All right. Well, do you have any final thoughts on the movie or the novel?
You know, as usual, like I came in kind of unsure where I sat, just a general like of the movie, and after discussing with you, I really do love it. You know, I'm not racing to watch it again by any means, but like having watched it, I feel really good, and it felt, I don't know, it felt like a bit of an enlightening kind of step in my movie going because I understood and saw things that I don't necessarily look for or tend to see. With usually they're out of sight.
Well, I can say, I don't know if it'll be this year or next year. I like to do anniversaries, but that'll be way too long. Get Shorty, which I think again came out in 95 or 96. That is another Elmore Leonard novel to a movie in which John Travolta plays, he's like a mob enforcer, like a heavy guy who gets sent out to Los Angeles and ends up in the movie business. And that's another like kind of charming, dangerous crime film that I'd like to revisit and talk to you about, because I think it'd be up your alley. And Jackie Brown, we got a lot to talk about in the coming time, but our time now I think is up. We are out of time talking about Out of Sight. So Cole, you kind of mentioned some of your stuff, but take us out with where people can find you and what do you want to promote in the between now and the next time we talk.
ColeRush.com has all of my work. Lots of gambling stuff lately, but one highlight from my pop culture writing Well, number one, I reviewed Out of Sight for thequilltolive.com, so you can find that there. Number two, I wrote a follow-up piece to my previous magnum opus about animation. In this one, I interviewed three people. I had them each watch two animated movies and kind of discussed whether these movies were capable of changing their preconceived notions about animation. Small spoiler, the results were generally positive, and it was a ton of fun to write and interview these folks. So I hope that people will read it and maybe watch the movies I talked about there. Most of them were very good.
Excellent. Well, yeah, I'll definitely have to check that out. And folks, the links to all of Cole's stuff will be in the description, including his review of Out of Sight, which now that I've read the book and watched the movie again, I'm going to go read and see if I agree with Cole, even though I know I do, because we just spent an hour talking about how much we agree with each other. But anyhow, thank you, sir. We'll be back next month. I can't remember what we have on the docket. It's going to be something, but I think we're just doing a late screening, right?
That sounds about right, because Harry
okay.
Potter would be July.
Yeah, that's the books get longer the more they go on, so I think I should start reading that
Actually,
last week.
We have read the longest book in the Harry Potter series already.
Really?
Yep,
Okay.
6 and 7 are slightly shorter than 5.
All
And I've
right.
already read 6. I finished it last week. So I am ready.
Well, I hope you remember all that for 2 months from now, because
I mean, this was probably my 8th or 9th time reading it. So I think I'm okay.
okay, I would assume. It's kind of like me with viewings of Out of Sight.
Yep.
All right, sir. Well, thanks again. Take care, and we'll be back next month with something.
Catch you then.
All right. Hey, everybody. It's me, Ian. You just saw me talking to Cole a couple of seconds ago, but I had to pop in here because we recorded that show on Friday, and it's now Sunday afternoon. It'll be Monday by the time you're watching this, or maybe some other day if you're watching this in the far-flung future. But it's been bothering me all weekend that I actually had notes prepared for our out-of-sight page-to-screen discussion, and I completely lost them in time to talk to Cole about the film and the book. So I wanted to pop in here with a couple of observations that I had meant to talk to him about, but I didn't get around to because it completely slipped my mind because of, as I mentioned, lost notes. The first is Viola Davis. This was an early performance from her playing Moselle, a very minor character in the story of both the film and the book. She essentially plays the sister of one of Snoop's his main guy in Detroit, Kenneth, and she kind of helps to inform Karen Sisco of where the big deal of Dick the Ripper's kind of house bust is going to happen. I think that there's far more attention paid to it in the novel than in the film, but it's just one of those weird things where you think of Viola Davis now. You know, she's Amanda Waller in the DC universe. She was the Woman King. She's been in tons of different films. You know, won all the awards, and she's just this great lofty actress here in 2023. But back in 1998, I'm not sure what she had done prior to this, but you know, she certainly wasn't the Viola Davis we know and love today. The second observation is, and I'm really kicking myself because this is, of course, page to screen, which means we're supposed to be comparing the novel to the film, and it's something I wanted to bring up to Cole while I was reading the book, but again, no notes. The big house raid on Dick the Ripper's residence in the book. Dick the Ripper is not home. It's Alexander, who is a college kid who's house sitting for the multimillionaire business swindler who has gone to Florida. In the movie, I think the Florida trip is a cover story, but Dick is actually hiding in a private room, and he eventually gets found out. But in the novel, it's Alexander, this 20-something kid, and he's having an affair with the maid. In the movie, Dick the Ripper is actually there, and he's having the affair with the maid, Midge, played by Nancy Allen. I like the movie version better only because in the novel, Dick not being there, uh, I don't know what it adds to the story in terms of the narrative. Whereas in the film, let me just put this out there: Elmore Leonard did not create a character called Dick the Ripper who shows up in the novel as an actual presence. He's referenced he's mentioned. I don't think he has any dialogue, and there's no scenes with between he and Snoop or he and Jack Foley like there are in the movie. So it makes sense when at the end he's not around. It's kind of becomes this big joke, which sort of plays out in the film, but it doesn't make as much sense as it does in the book. In the movie, of course, as I mentioned earlier, you've got Albert Brooks, so you got to give him as much business to do because he's great and he's also a name. So why not use him? But as far as his importance to the story, yeah, I like seeing that interaction between him and the bad guys that he met in prison more so than anything that was going on with this college kid who was house sitting or whatever. So that's pretty much all I want to do was pop in, as I mentioned, and mention those two things, because you may be out there, if you've made it this long through the video, thank you. But just if you are a fan of the Elmore Leonard novel and or the Steven Soderbergh film, you might be watching Page to Screen expecting, hey, are you going to talk about this major difference at the end of the book and at the end of the film? And yes, I wanted to. I didn't, but now I have, and now I'm done. So as I said before, thanks everybody, and take care.